In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint this lovely floral heart. I'm Katrina Pete, a watercolor artist, and I love painting florals. First things first, make it easy on yourself and create a heart using a folded piece of paper and then simply just trace it. I'm erasing some of my outline because it got a bit too dark. I want it nice and light so that I can see kind of a boundary where I'm going to put my flowers. For this floral heart, I'm going for a loose sort of peachy pink color with some nice spring greens. And so I mixed up this color using a bit of opera pink and a nice warm yellow, like Naples yellow or something that's just got a touch of gold in it. And what I'm doing here is I'm just going to create a very loose rounded shape. So this is a peony that isn't opened up all the way, and I'm starting with a very light layer. Don't worry too much if your flower doesn't have a lot of definition. At this stage, it might look like a bit of a blob. This is just a background first layer, and we will be adding more definition in the second layer. You'll see that I did leave a few little white gaps of dry paper in the center of the flower, and that's just to show some maybe highlights of the inner petals. I'm going to drop in a bit of that darker color into the center and the outer edge. Now, the important thing is not to get too detailed at this stage of the painting. So this flower looks very loose. It doesn't have a lot of definition yet. I'm going to add another flower, this time in more of an orangish peachy color. So I'm adding just a bit more of that yellow. And this time I'm making a peony that's more like a bud. So here's a side view of it. You can see just a little petal on the side kind of sticking out. But then again, these are very simple rounded shapes. I'm also making sure that I point them in different directions. Now you can touch in a bit more paint into some of the outer edges. This gives them some definition. I'm going to add a third bloom here using a brush loaded with just clear water, touching the other bloom so the paint bleeds into it, creating just a very loose open peony shape, and dropping in some of that color into the center and along some of the edges. Then I'll add a tiny pink bud here using just a few C-shaped brush strokes, leaving a highlight in the middle of dry paper. Putting in another bud right here using some C-shaped brush strokes and then softening one of the edges with a thirsty brush. I'm using rose madder in a more concentrated color for the buds, since they tend to be smaller and bolder in color. Let's put a bigger bloom over here. This time I'm starting with the center, leaving some little white gaps, curving softly around, similar to a rose. And as I get to the outer petals, I'm making them wider and fluffier. Now I'm dropping in some color, some darker rose madder into that center, adding another petal over here and one to the other side to balance it all out. Now at this stage of the painting, some of the flowers are starting to dry, and I want to add in a few little green leaves before they dry completely. And this is because I really like the way my greens blend into my blooms. So I'm using a smaller brush here. This is a number 6 by Silver Black Velvet. It comes to a really fine point, which I think is great for leaves. And you'll see me mixing up a pretty strong mixture of sap green. And this is a nice spring olive green. And I'm just making little green leaf shapes in different sizes to kind of fill in those areas between the flowers. Now let's fill in the rest of this heart. I'm using a number 12 again, and I am going to be painting the outer edges of this flower using the tip of the brush to create those triangular shapes. So this flower is sort of facing upward a bit. And you'll see that as I move toward the outer edges of my heart, my flowers are more of a side view rather than facing forward toward the viewer. And I'm going to fill in this left side a little bit with just another bloom. I paint the back petals first, then I leave a tiny little space and paint the petals that are forward or closer to the viewer, And that little gap just kind of gives the illusion of a flower facing on the side. Then I'm going to fill in the gaps with my little green leaves. One trick to painting leaves is that I typically start with the outer tip of the leaf. So I'm using the very tip of my brush, that's the smallest point, and then I drag it, and as I'm dragging the brush, I'm pushing down on the belly of the brush, and that creates a wider leaf shape. I'm looking at the bottom flower here in the bottom left area, and I need to add a bit more darker petals just along the edges to give it a little bit of definition. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now. Let's fill in the bottom right here using my number 12. I'm starting at the petals using the tip of the brush, pulling back inward with a curved shape, joining all the petals at the base, and then I'm going to drop in some of that darker rose color at the base of the flower just to give it a bit more definition. Now there's a bit of a gap between those two flowers, so I'm filling it in with some greenery. I'm using a smaller brush for the leaves because it gives me a little bit more control. Let's finish out the rest of this heart. I'm making some tinier flower shapes using little C-shaped brush strokes and then connecting them. Let's put another bloom here facing toward the right, sweeping your brush into a C shape with each petal and joining the petals at the base. I'm using that fine tip of my brush to clean up some of the edges of the petals too. I'm going to drop in a bit of that rose madder into some of the flowers to give them even more definition. And you can see in some of the flowers, the first layer is starting to dry, so that paint will not spread very well. It won't create a nice faded effect, and I can show you how to soften that edge in just a little bit. Now I'm going to fill out the right side of this heart with just a bud that will fit right here using curved brush strokes. In that same pink, I'm going to drop it into the center of this other bloom. I'm just going to fill in some of these edges where there's a bit of a gap by painting just a side view of a flower. And then I plan to fill in some of the gaps again with my greenery, making sure that I create leaves that are pointing in different directions. Using a smaller brush helps for this step because if you use too big of a brush, you'll have too much paint and water on your brush and it might bleed too far into your flowers. The flowers that are still damp. So this step of the process just helps give some more definition. I'm noticing I'm going to need to add another little bloom on the right side of my heart just to give it a bit of balance. Now, part of loose floral painting is balancing those soft, airy petals with punches of dark accents like these green leaves. I'm using a fairly saturated, and when I say saturated, what I mean is that the paint on my brush doesn't have a lot of water mixed into it. So the more water we use to dilute our paint, the lighter it becomes in value. Or you could also say it's less intense. So for this piece, I'm trying to show how you can balance those soft, airy, fluttery blooms with dark punches of greenery and areas of more higher contrast. So I'm going to finish out this heart by just taking a step back. That might help, but what I'm trying to do is fill in with tinier petals just to give it more of a full and lush appearance. So now that my first layer has completely dried, I'm going to give some definition to these blooms. I'm using a flat brush. It's just a brush that looks like it has a square tip, and this will give me some angular marks that will define some of these petals. This is a number 8, and I'm going to start with this flower facing up toward the right, and I'm going to just create some bits of shadowing between the petals. I'm going to carve out this petal here by painting the inner petals behind it a darker rose color. You can see using a brush with a really flat tip, you can create these sort of carved out petal shapes. Let's just pop in a shadow there to that little petal sticking out, and then add a bit more darker petals to this little bud here on the sides and the top, and a fine line right there separating 2 petals. Now if you look over toward my palette, you'll see that the mix I have on there is bolder. It's a bit of a richer color. Now this little pink bud here, I'm just going to deepen the base of that just to give it the look like it's tucked in behind this bigger one in front, and same with this other little bud over here. And now I'm going to pull out a petal, starting with the outer edge, and I'm going to pull it back into the bloom, just like that. I'm sort of imagining where these petals might be, and the areas that I'm leaving dry are acting as a highlight. Let's carve out the shadow on this petal over here, on the inside petal, pushing down on my flat brush to create a broad shaped petal, and then a fine line with just the edge of the brush, and a mark right there at the tip. Now for those blooms that are in the middle of the heart, I'm going to add some of those detailed stamens that are in the center of peony flowers, and I'm going to use a mixture of yellow ochre with my Naples yellow, and just these little bits of dots since they're facing the viewer, so I'm putting them right in the middle here. And I'm using a smaller round brush for this type of detail, just giving the suggestion of these stamens. It doesn't have to look perfect, but adding this bit of a detail gives these flowers some contrast as well. Let's add one more layer of petals to these lighter blooms. For these forward-facing blooms, I think it helps to start with an outer edge of the petal and then pull down into the center of your bloom. Here I'm just painting in some of the inner petals, and they're a little bit darker, and then defining just a couple edges of the outer petals that are folding outward. I'm noticing that I have quite a bit of pink going on, so I want to balance that with a bit more peach. So I'm going to mix up some more yellow onto my palette and get a nice peach color going here. And then I'll just keep adding more petals to these blooms. Now right here I made a petal, but it's too dark for my liking, so I'm taking a thirsty brush and I'm just going to fade it out a bit. A thirsty brush is just a brush that's slightly damp, so it can remove paint. It acts like a sponge. Let's just add a bit of definition to the outer edges of this flower. It'll just complete that other edge of my heart. Now this little peony here is facing the side, so I'm going to just give a few of the petals some definition to create that side view. And I'm following the curvature of this flower, so keep that in mind too with each brush stroke. Give this little bud some more of a pop by adding some of that peachy color. A petal like it's sort of falling off to the side. You can create rounded shapes with your flat brush as well. Just make some C-shaped strokes and have them meet in the middle. Now let's define the edges of this flower here and there, just to give it some more definition. Now it blends in with the rest of the piece. Now this painting is nearly complete. I think it helps to take a step back and have an overall look at your piece or hold it up in the mirror, and this will help you decide what you need to do next. So now I'm going to add another layer onto my leaves and darken up a few areas. So I'm using that sap green with just a touch of blue, and I'm just going to use it to create some more depth within the greenery. The blue I used was Winsor blue, but you can use any color blue. Indigo would work too. And again, I'm just creating some balance, and creating some little pockets of darker leaves really helps those lighter, more pastel colored flowers stand out. And there we have it. I hope you enjoyed this watercolor floral heart tutorial, and I can't wait to see what you create.